Okay, everybody. Nice to see you all. Thanks to those of you who are here in the synchronous class. Make sure to put your name in the chat if you haven't done so already for purposes of attendance, so I can count you as being here. We're going to continue on with Marx today. Some nuts and bolts announcements to start the class. Since we didn't quite get all the way through the Manifesto of the Communist Party last time, that's where we're going to pick up again today. I'm going to do one extra class on Marx. So we'll have 3 classes left about Marx. So today we'll do the Manifesto and we'll get started. We'll finish off the Manifesto of the Communist Party, and then we'll get started with looking at writings from Das Kapital. We will also talk then about Marx on Monday and Wednesday of next week. Because of that, I will back up your next perusal assignment to being due on Monday the 29th instead of Wednesday the 24th. Likewise, you will have your first quiz that will be due on the 29th, and it'll open up on Monday the 22nd. So I hope you remember how I described it on the first day of class and also in the syllabus. These quizzes are not like pop quizzes. They are more like take-home tests or open book tests that you have a week to complete. So you can open the quiz starting on this Monday, the 22nd, and look at the questions, and then sort of dig into the material using whatever notes you have at your disposal. And you have a week to basically answer those questions. So you can sort of open it up, look at the questions, close it, come back to it, as long as you get it done by the 29th. The quiz will consist of 20 multiple choice and true-false questions, and they'll all be about Marx. We'll also have quizzes later in the semester about Durkheim and Max Weber. That's all the nuts and bolts announcements that I can think of at the moment. Any questions from those of you who are here with us live? Okay, I will go then to the screen share where we will be looking at Manifesto of the Communist Party. Just one second. This is where we left off last time. Last time, you hopefully remember, we had gotten to this part of the manifesto where, although it's called like the Manifesto of the Communist Party, what they're really discussing here is capitalism. So there are all these sentences that begin with like the bourgeoisie does this, the bourgeoisie does that. Remember that the bourgeoisie is basically what is what we would today call like the capitalist class, the 1%, the CEOs, the people that own the means of production, that own the wealth, that own the businesses, that own the corporations, etc. And we had sort of, to summarize the point that we've gotten to, Marx and Engels are basically describing capitalism as this system that is enormously productive on the one hand, very innovative, creates new technologies, big cities, what they call the productive forces. But on the other hand, is very unstable and very destructive. Um, it destroys at the same time that it creates. And I think it's well summarized in this sentence from this preceding paragraph at the end of this paragraph, where they say, all that is solid melts into air, and all that is holy is profaned. So that there's living in a capitalist society is like living in a state of constant change, where the pace of change is accelerated. And so traditions and things that were solid are swept away. Things that seemed solid, you know, things that seemed like they would last forever are wiped out, in the blink of an eye, or the click of a mouse today. And all that is holy is profaned in the sense that things that were considered sacred, whether it's family or whether it's revered occupations like priests and doctors, these things that had been considered to be sacred or holy are suddenly profaned when they have a price tag attached to them, when they become reduced to matters of money. Marx is kind of playing on this long-standing idea that money is kind of like sacrilegious. This is why, like, Jesus gets mad, for example, in the New Testament when people are outside the church, selling stuff. It's like the church and what makes it sacred is supposed to be immune to that kind of money changing and selling and commodity exchange. So this has a long history that long predates Marx. This idea that money is kind of sacrilegious, that it profanes whatever it touches. I had quoted the Bob Dylan lyric in that last class where Dylan had sang, "Money doesn't talk, it swears," so that it speaks in this kind of profane language. Um, so with that sort of description, where they go to next anticipates what we today call globalization, where they say that the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. So globalization was not like a thing. It was not a word in Marx and Engels' time, but they were able to see that this was going to happen in the future, that it was already happening in their time, and it was just going to get more and more extreme, whereby, companies today, we call them multinational corporations, are looking to constantly expand their markets, to sell more stuff to more people. And so, after Marx died, in 1883, you have, everything from Coca-Cola to Disney to Hollywood movies to pop music, to Western fashion. All of these things get spread around the globe. And the part where all that is solid melts into air comes into play is that as this globalization occurs, it erases the traditions and the cultures and the communities that had been, established previously. Um, that it sort of wipes out local cultures and local traditions. And so they describe here in this next longer kind of paragraph, beginning with the bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. And then in the third sentence, it says, all old established national industries have been destroyed or are being destroyed. Um, they are dislodged by new industries whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones, industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In place of the old wants satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production, the intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. So globalization happens, and it erases the previous local and national traditions and cultures, even like literature, as it mentions here. And people are instilled with like new wants that are met, from distant lands and climes. People want Coca-Cola and MTV and Disney and Taylor Swift and, Labubus and, you name it, that there becomes like this sort of globalized demand for these kind of consumer products. And so the world becomes increasingly kind of like McDonaldized. You find McDonald's in virtually every country of the world. And so things become kind of more standardized and generic. And what was once local or national is erased. And we see to this day, this is a thing that people are angry about. The way that like their cultures are becoming Disneyfied and McDonaldized. Somebody once called it Coca colonization, like colonization by Coca-Cola, and it changes, people's tastes, their preferences, what they want. It changes their culture. It, sort of has this kind of impact where all that is solid melts into air and all that is holy is profaned. And so a talk here about further about how this happens by saying the bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communications, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. This is, I think, like a fairly poetic passage, very lively prose, as I said. Something that characterizes the Communist Manifesto is it's very lively prose. And again, what they're saying here is that every country, every locality has to adopt this bourgeois mode of production, as they say, on pain of extinction. Like that, basically, the banks and the corporations put a gun to the head, a metaphorical gun to the head of these countries, and it's like you have to either kind of globalize or die. And so that's what they mean by that it forces even the most barbarian nations into civilization. And it does this, you'll notice in the first sentence, by means of communication, by technologies, and specifically by technologies of communication. So in Marx's time, that was like the telegraph. Um, in our time, of course, that it would be like the internet, right? The internet is the means of communications that facilitates this kind of globalization of culture. This sense in which like um, everyone is subjected to the same kind of Disneyfied, McDonaldized culture through the media and through the internet and social media, these kinds of means of communication. Um, Now, I do want to note just one thing before I leave this discussion of globalization. Marx and Engels don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. They're sort of like ambivalent. They see the cons, the negative side of this process, but they also see some unintentional positives. Now, remember, as I said about the Communist Manifesto, it's building this argument that basically capitalism is going to self-destruct and that it unintentionally provides the proletariat with the weapons to destroy it. The bourgeoisie creates its own gravediggers, is the way that they put it. And in the case of globalization, it's like, well, what's happening here is that, yeah, like local and national cultures are being erased, but it's creating this kind of international global culture in which workers can communicate and develop a kind of like international solidarity. you know Workers can find out what's going on around the world, just by opening up their laptop. We are more globally interconnected, and what that makes possible is a kind of an international workers movement. Remember that the slogan at the end of the Communist Manifesto is workers of the world unite, right? Not workers of one nation, workers of Britain, workers of America, workers of the world. And in order for workers of the world to unite, you have to have these like means of communication. And it helps that you actually have this kind of global culture where like, you know, everybody in the world knows who like Tupac is, you know, or, everybody in the world, knows like there's a global kind of hip hop culture is what I'm trying to say, for example. It allows people to develop this kind of international solidarity and to communicate with one another across national boundaries and borders. So this is like an unintentionally revolutionary effect of globalization, is to create this dynamic in which workers of the world can unite across borders. And they believe that this is something that's very necessary. that workers have to have this kind of international solidarity. Um, so keep that in mind. They are not like anti-globalization per se. They view this as it with ambivalence, that there are these pros and these cons. So that's important. Likewise, in the next passage, they talk here about what we call urbanization, that the population becomes more and more concentrated in cities. And this is, again, a result of industrialization and capitalism, is basically people go to the cities because that's where the jobs are. That's where the factories are. That's where the offices are. People become more concentrated in urban life. And so that's what they're talking about here, where they say, like, the bourgeoisie has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural. And in the next paragraph says the bourgeoisie keeps more and more doing away with the scattered state of the population. So again, there's a positive and a negative to this. The cities, are often where we find the worst kind of poverty and overcrowding, and where we see all kinds of like industrial pollution and negative social and environmental conditions. But the cities are also where, like, now workers are concentrated, um, living and working together. Whereas in rural societies, they were scattered. The word that they use is scattered. People were scattered across the countryside. So like peasants, living in little villages across the countryside, like they were oppressed, and they were, in many cases, starving or, poor, but they were less able to do anything about it because they were scattered. They were less able to organize and get together. Whereas workers in the cities, because they're concentrated, they can go on strike, they can demonstrate, they can protest, they can riot, they can engage in all kinds of activities that are threatening to the bourgeoisie. So here again, we have this example of how the bourgeoisie has unintentionally created its own gravediggers. It's concentrated all these exploited working class people together in these cities and ghettos, around the world, these favelas and shanty towns, and like all the impoverished and exploited peoples and oppressed peoples of the world are living and working right next to each other, and that creates this kind of like dynamite. It creates this kind of explosive potential in which workers can organize and rise up and take collective action. And so again, like this is an instance of this sort of ironic turn in which capitalism creates the very conditions for its potential overthrow. That's what they're sort of getting at here in both the section on globalization and in the section on urbanization. So remember, as I said in the last class, Marx and Engels do not deny that capitalism is the most productive economic system in the history of the world. Certainly more so than feudalism. There's no denying that capitalism creates these new technologies, these big cities, and it's described here in this rather poetic passage that I've highlighted here, where they say the bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. So in like 100 years, they've produced more than all the generations that came before them combined. And then they list these, um, uh, they sort of list these accomplishments. They say subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. And then they ask, what earlier century had even such a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? Like, who would have thought that this was even possible 100 years ago? All of these technological um, advances and technological advances in the sense of what they say like is subjection of nature's forces to man and machinery. So basically they're talking about like the conquest of nature, you know, the use of science and technology and chemistry and agriculture and you know, all of these forms of technology and innovations that are basically like conquering and subduing nature and making nature into um, something profitable. And so, again, they have no, um, they don't doubt that this is the most economically productive system in the history of the world. And they say then, we see then the means of production and of exchange on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of the means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in one word, the feudal relations of property, became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters, they had to burst asunder, they were burst asunder. So, if you'll remember last week, I pointed out, but basically what they are arguing is that capitalism emerged from within feudalism. The metaphor that I used was like that capitalism was like born in the womb of, you know, or created in the womb of feudalism. And they believe in the same way that communism will be created within the womb of capitalism. You know, that like that communism will be the result of these contradictions that occur within capitalist society. And so we've already mentioned a couple of them in the preceding paragraphs. Globalization and urbanization are two factors in which capitalism unwittingly or unintentionally creates the possibilities for a communist future, for a kind of revolution. That's the way that they see history. They believe that history works in this kind of way. The philosophical approach that this is known as is dialectics. The idea that new things emerge within the womb of the old. Another, just to continue, I guess, with the pregnancy metaphors, they say another way they put it is that everything is pregnant with its contrary, right? So that like systems give birth to the things that will destroy and overcome it. You might also think back to like Frankenstein, in this sense. So then I continue with another one of my favorite sentences, and great way to put this. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. This is paraphrasing a passage from the story of Faust, which is this sort of epic tale of the deal with the devil, the Faustian bargain, in which it gives us this kind of metaphor of the sorcerer, who calls up a spell, who casts a spell that then escapes the sorcerer's control, and so likewise they're saying that basically capitalism, in the way that is creating all these productive forces, the way that it is globalizing and creating these new cities, and expanding the productive forces, creating new technologies, creating new means of communication. All of those things make the bourgeoisie like the sorcerer. They create these things that then escape their control, and may then come back to haunt them and destroy them. Again, this kind of metaphor of that they're creating their own grave diggers. So this is again, I think, like a pretty powerful bit of prose to kind of summarize, what they've been saying to this point about the contradictory impact of capitalism, the way in which capitalism is pregnant with its contrary. In here they talk they get into then in the rest of that paragraph a little bit more detail about how capitalism is sort of prone to crisis, and this is something that we see throughout the history of capitalism, is that it's enormously productive on the one hand, but it's also chronically unstable. That we see these, what today we would call like booms and busts, or we have like these speculative bubbles, that burst. Like we had the real estate bubble that burst in 2008, or the tech bubble that has exploded a couple of times. The capitalism is like this very fast roller coaster. It's very fast, but it's kind of out of control. And so one thing that we see throughout economic history of capitalism, is that there's always these like recessions and depressions. Like there'll be these huge booms, and then they'll be followed by these busts and declines. That there's this kind of cyclical nature to the capitalist system. So we have these kind of cycles of depression and recessions every few years, these booms and busts. And what they're saying in this paragraph is that, ironically, the thing that causes this is overproduction, an excess of production, producing too much. That's what is talked about in this part that I've highlighted here. It basically is saying that overproduction, I think in the video, it kind of the documentary, it explained a little bit about this too, that It's all of a sudden we're producing more than people like workers are able to consume, right? Like, so workers are not able to like consume the things that they are producing. And so what happens is you get this excess of overproduction that causes the markets to periodically crash. So in some ways, this is kind of exactly what happened with like the housing market. Um, so they're describing here again a kind of an an irony in which they believe that capitalism will ultimately kind of self-destruct because of this dynamic of overproduction. Not produce It's not that it's not producing enough, it's that it's producing more than the market can bear. So that's sort of what's described here. Now, in this next section, they kind of pivot. They've been talking about the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie does this, the bourgeoisie does that. And in this section, they turn to the proletariat. And they say, like, the weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. So it's created its gravediggers. It's the bourgeoisie has given birth to its contrary, to that which will eventually destroy it. And so here he kind of like defines what he means, or they define what they mean by the proletariat, the working class. They say in proportion as the bourgeoisie, i.e., capital, is developed, in the same proportion as the proletariat, the modern working class developed. And here they define it as a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. So these the what it means to be a proletariat, to be a worker, is to be kind of dependent. You have to be able to get a job in order to live. You have to be able to get a job in order to get a wage to buy the things that you need to live. And in order to get a job, you have to be able to increase capital. You have to be able to um, help your employer make a profit, in other words. And if you don't help your employer make a profit, there's no reason to hire you, you know? So, like, you labor only, so you find work only so far as your labor increases capital. Um, the way that Marx will put this in Capital is to say that workers have to create surplus value. The workers have to create a surplus. They have to create more value in their jobs than what they are paid in the form of wages. You know, you have to create that surplus. And if you don't create a surplus, then why would anybody hire you? Why would anybody employ you unless you can help them make a profit? So that is the way that proletarians are being defined here in this paragraph. These laborers who must sell themselves piecemeal are a commodity like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. So you have like times like, say, the Great Depression, where the unemployment rate went up to 25%. In the United States, the unemployment rate was 25% in 1933. And so and that destroys people's lives, destroys entire communities and neighborhoods. So people are kind of at the mercy of the market, is what they're saying. They're kind of at the mercy of this kind of competition. And here they describe more more in depth a bit about like how um, the working class is basically alienated from their labor. They say the work of proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. I think about that sentence, in the sense of like we become an appendage of the machine. We're like, the computer's right arm or something. What it's suggesting is that the machines are kind of in charge, and we as workers, are kind of like just an appendage of them, and a that's like a world turned upside down, where things rule over people, machines rule over workers. Um, and so Marx never lived to see a computer, but like he anticipated again that this was the dynamic. He certainly never lived to see artificial intelligence, but this is the dynamic in which people are more or less kind of reduced to being an appendage of the machine. You know, the machine is the real body, and we're just like its leg or its arm or its hand. It's quite a striking image when you think of it. You know, it's and this is like going back to the economic and philosophic manuscripts. This is what they mean by alienation. How people are kind of robbed of their ability to create and produce, and dehumanized and reduced to an object like existence, a thing like existence. And so you'll notice just a lot of the same kinds of things like that they say in the 1844 manuscripts, like in proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. What is more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion, the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by the increase of the work exacted in a given time, or by increased speed of machinery, etc. So workers are producing more, and their work lives are also getting worse. And those, it's not like coincidental. Those things are related. How are you all doing out there? Anybody got a question for me? I get tired of hearing myself talk after a while. I need like some kind of feedback or interaction. Let me just get some water. Okay. The section that follows is basically a description of how the proletariat develops as a class, and how they become more and more like stronger and more organized and more they develop more like class consciousness, leading up to a kind of revolution. So that's beginning in this section where they say the proletariat goes through various stages of development. So in the preceding part, they've described the bourgeoisie, and now they are sort of describing like different stages through which the proletariat um, becomes more like revolutionary. How the proletariat becomes more and more like this powerful organized force. So it doesn't start off that way. You know, they talk about um, uh, Page had asked a really good question here that I tried to clarify, where it says, you know, they say at first the you know in this early stage the proletarians don't really fight their enemies, but the enemies of their enemies. And what they're sort of referring to here is like the French Revolution, in which workers fought on the side of the bourgeoisie. The workers fought, you know, alongside the bourgeoisie against the monarchy and the aristocracy, against, you know, the king and the queen. And out of that French Revolution, though, it was the bourgeoisie who basically gained power. They became the ruling class over and sort of supplanted the aristocracy and the monarchy. So this is the kind of an early stage. Okay. Um, and then they're like, okay, but then and then in the next stage, you know, the proletariat increases in number, so it becomes larger, but it also becomes more concentrated. Remember, this is the thing about urbanization, right? They're not only more workers, but they're like living and working right next to each other. They're all living in the same, you know, cities and neighborhoods and ghettos and so forth. And so its strength grows, and it feels that strength more. They sort of describe some of the early manifestations in which workers begin to go on strike. They begin to form unions. In some cases, they riot. Um, they're all these forms of like collective action that are made possible by the fact that the proletariat is not only growing in numbers, but also more concentrated. And they're able to communicate with each other in a way that like peasants had not been able to do, because the peasants were scattered across the countryside in these little villages. So this is kind of the next stage. And then, you know, now and then the workers are victorious, in the sense, you know, that they form unions, or, you know, one of the reforms that Marx talks about is the end of the 12-hour day, how workers were victorious in getting the 10-hour workday in his time, and then later the 8-hour workday. These were not things that the capitalist class did out of the generosity of their hearts. These were things that were fought for, and people died for, and people went to jail for. These were struggles. Likewise with child labor. You know, the abolition of child labor was a major victory for the working class that was made possible only because they were unionizing and organizing and making demands. The capitalist class gave up on child labor reluctantly. You saw in the video like in the documentary, how like in the coal mines, they routinely hired child laborers, because they were like smaller and they could crawl through those horrible coal mines and reach their little hands into places that adults might not be able to access, or like the way that child labor is still utilized in like textiles, um, sweatshop labor essentially. So that victory has not been total. We still live in a world of child labor, but workers, to the extent that they've been able to put limits on that, it has been a victory for the working class. It was not something that the capitalist class agreed to do out of the generosity of their hearts. So they're starting to talk about, occasionally there are these reforms, these victories, in terms of like the length of the working day, in terms of working conditions, in terms of workers getting, better, higher pay, better insurance. The whole concept of like the weekend is the result of working class struggles. You know, this is again not a thing that that was done from the top down. It was something that was the result of action from the bottom up, from popular struggles. So I sort of like talk about that in this paragraph, in my comment here. And so yeah, there were these reforms that were won by an organized working class. So here at the end of this paragraph, he mentions the 10-hour bills, the 10 hours bill in England, which was basically like the 10 hours was considered like the standard workday, whereas before, most people had worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, you know, and that was just like the standard. The 8-hour workday was more like a product of the 20th century. People started fighting for the 8-hour workday in the 1860s, but it didn't become like law. It didn't become legal until like 1913. So it took like 50 years. And again, a lot of people died. A lot of people were sent to prison. A lot of people, made a lot of sacrifices so that workers, could enjoy the weekend, and like only had to work 8 hours a day. So I think that's something to keep in mind. So the argument here is like kind of building. It's like kind of snowballing, like it again, it talks about the bourgeoisie supplies the proletariat with um, these tools that they can use to defeat them, these weapons that they can use in the class struggle. Another one of them is education, right? Like the reason that you're all in college is because employers, on the one hand, they benefit from having an educated workforce. You know, they want their workers to be more trained, skilled, and educated, especially when it comes to information and technology and these sorts of things. Employers benefit from having an educated workforce. But then you also like you go to school and you learn about the Communist Manifesto. You get woke, as they say. This is real threatening, to the elites, It's like they want an educated workforce, but they don't want a woke workforce, you know? They don't want people that have like, this political and general education. And you see this kind of tension throughout history. We're seeing it today, right? Like they want people to go to college, but they don't want them to like learn about like history and exploitation and Marxism and all this kind of thing. It kind of makes me feel like what we're doing here is kind of special, you know? And and so they kind of like toggle back and forth between investing in education and then like "Nah, maybe we don't we don't want this kind of education." So what they'd really like is for people to go to go to school to just learn how to do a job. They'd like vocational training. Whereas, what people like me do is kind of more like in this form of like general education, like liberal arts education, you know. Um, and so this is also kind of like dangerous for them, We're giving the proletariat the weapon of knowledge. You see this going back to times of slavery, like when enslaved people were deliberately kept illiterate. Like you could be lynched or whipped just for trying to learn how to read and write. That they deliberately kept the enslaved population illiterate and ignorant. And then, when the Civil War ended and the slaves were free, there was then this kind of thirst for knowledge. All these schools got built. These, what they today call historically black colleges, built, especially across the South, because there's this kind of pent up thirst for knowledge and literacy. So there's this long-standing tension around education. And so then finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, this kind of they're building up the plot in this very dramatic way, the decisive hour, progress of disillusion going on within the ruling class. In fact, within the whole range of old society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Just as, therefore, at an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular, a portion of the bourgeois ideologists who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole. So you get this image of like kind of this increasing polarization of society. And you have some people who are kind of like class traitors, that they may be rich people, they may be bourgeois, but they sympathize and identify with the struggle of the proletariat. And so they go over to their kind of ranks, over to their side of things. And an interesting discussion here around what's called the lumpen proletariat. Thank you, Precious, for adding and extending this, what they call the dangerous class, the social scum. This is what a part where I think Marx and Engels are kind of wrong. But yeah, they're talking here about, as Precious's comment says, drug dealers, criminals, prostitutes, swindlers, people who live on the margins of society, and who often experience unstable work and are kind of thrown to the margins of the society. And Marx and Engels don't think that those kind of people are very revolutionary. They think that the real revolutionaries are like the people who actually have jobs and are, like steadily employed in a factory or an office or something like that. Um, but later social movements, particularly the Black Panthers, when the Black Panthers started in Oakland in 1966 and 1967, the Black Panthers thought that the lumpen proletariat were revolutionary. They identified with the lumpen proletariat. They thought, these were their people, the people who were most marginalized, out in West Oakland, living in ghettos and being, constantly patrolled by the police and harassed and beaten by the police. So other groups have, um, tried to incorporate the lumpen proletariat into this kind of revolutionary class, and I'm more persuaded by that than I am by Marx and Engels here. So this is kind of, again, like building this kind of this sort of drama, um, and as it says, like the proletariat, the lowest stratum of present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. It goes back a little bit to what we talked about with the German ideology, where in the German ideology, um, Marx and Engels are kind of saying, well, that the bourgeoisie sort of pretends to be, to speak for everybody or to act in the interests of everybody, but they're really just represent these particular interests. They represent, just this their own particular interests while seeming to be in the general interest. With the proletariat, this is not a problem because the proletariat speaks for almost everyone, except the bourgeoisie. So the proletariat is the movement of the vast majority of people in the world, and it is therefore, when they become revolutionary, it changes the entire social fabric. Whereas something like the French Revolution, it was more like one elite replaced the previous elite. It was more of a changing of who the ruling class was, from the aristocracy to the bourgeoisie. But in the case of a proletarian revolution, it will abolish the whole notion of a ruling class. It will abolish class itself, and because it is the movement of the 99%, as Occupy Wall Street people said, you know, and so it doesn't have to pretend to speak for everybody because it does speak for everybody. It does represent the interests of humanity in general, and not just the interests of a particular class. So the proletariat stages a revolution in order to kind of like abolish itself. The proletariat abolishes the whole notion of a working class, or the whole notion of class society, in the act of rising up and destroying uh, the capitalist system. And so then we finally come to this conclusion. I think I've quoted this 5 or 6 times to this point, where they say, what the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all is its own grave diggers. I find that a very interesting sentence. And then the next sentence, its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Well, that's the part that's kind of clearly wrong. It's not inevitable. Um, we have seen throughout history that, like, we still have capitalism. and the proletarian revolution is not on the menu, at least right now. It may be in the future, but it isn't now. And so the idea that this is an inevitability, um, while it makes for a good banger of a line in the manifesto, it's a real attention-getting line. On the other hand, it's like not factually correct, you know. So I think that part is kind of self-evident. In this last part, the second part that's called proletarians and communists, I have less to say about this. In part because it's more kind of like speaks for itself, and you don't really need me as much to interpret or set the context for this. A lot of this section here takes the form of this like imaginary dialogue in which Marx and Engels are kind of like having this imaginary argument with the people who, would criticize them or be naysayers. And so, like these kind of things about like, you accuse us of, abolishing the right of personally acquiring property. And, they say, well, that's not the kind of property that we mean. Everybody can have their own, everybody can have their own cell phones and labubus in the future. The kind of property that we mean is like, the means of production, the sort of the economic backbone of the society. So those are the this sort of bourgeois form of property that they want to abolish. They don't want to take away your labubu. Keep I like to reference labubu just because it's this new trend that I find fascinating. And I just also like to say the word labubu, but I don't know. Probably some of you know what it is, and some of you don't. These little like Chinese troll dolls that people, I see students putting on their backpacks and stuff all the time now. It's this fad. It's like the Beanie Babies of our time. Um, and I'm really fascinated by those kinds of commodities. Yeah, right. It is unfortunate that we all know Labubus. I'm teaching you from here from San Francisco State, and nearby there's a mall called the Stonestown Galleria where they sell Labubus. And at one point, there was such like a kind of a mob crowd demand for the newest Labubus that two customers like pepper sprayed each other, fighting to get their hands on a Labubu. Um, so